Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. Sir David Attenborough gave a very compelling opening speech at the United Nations Climate Conference in Glasgow last week.
Your Excellencies, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, as you spend the next 2 weeks debating, negotiating, persuading and compromising, as you surely must, it's easy to forget that ultimately the emergency climate comes down to a single number: the concentration of carbon in our atmosphere. The measure that greatly determines global temperature. And the changes in that one number is the clearest way to chart our own story, for it defines our relationship with our world. For much of humanity's ancient history, that number bounced wildly between 180 and 300. And so too did global temperatures. It was a brutal and unpredictable world. At times, our ancestors existed only in tiny numbers. But just over 10,000 years ago, that number suddenly stabilized, and with it, Earth's climate. We found ourselves in an unusually benign period, with predictable seasons and reliable weather. For the first time, civilization was possible, and we wasted no time in taking advantage of that. Everything we've achieved in the last 10,000 years was enabled by the stability during this time. The global temperature has not wavered over this period by more than plus or minus 1 degree Celsius. Until now.
It was excellent theater, except for the fact that it had almost nothing to do with reality. Let's take a look at what's actually occurred over the last 100 years and over much longer time periods before that. Over the past century, the Earth has become a much safer place for humans. Death rates from all types of natural disasters are down about 97% from a century ago. And if we look at only weather-related disasters, death rates are down about 99%. The evidence shows that we're having the exact opposite of a climate crisis. Huge numbers of people died from drought during the 1920s. In my recent videos, I've been talking a lot about the record heat waves and droughts of the 1920s, which killed large numbers of people. China has had a very severe famine almost every year for the past 2,000 years. For example, in the 2 years famine of 1877 and 1878, it's estimated that 9.5 million people starved to death in China. 1878 might have been the hottest year on record. As reported by the Minneapolis Tribune, Minnesota had no winter at all that year. Australia had record heat in 1878, 122 degrees in the shade at Bourke, New South Wales. And India also had unprecedented heat, which caused many deaths. Sir David is trying to convince people that the climate used to be safe, cool, and stable, when in fact the exact opposite is true. Now let's look at his claim about record levels of CO2. Atmospheric carbon dioxide is currently close to the lowest level of the last 600 million years. Life has thrived over this entire time, and in fact the greatest expansion of life on Earth occurred right here when carbon dioxide was at its peak. His belief that the climate was stable over the last 10,000 years has nothing to do with reality. During the 6th century, the climate was very cold, and this led to a plague which wiped out about half of the population of Europe. And a similar plague occurred during a very cold period in the 16th century. The 16th century was also a very difficult time in America. Cold and drought nearly wiped out the early colonists from Europe. A megadrought during the 16th century wreaked havoc for decades on the lives of Spanish and English settlers and American Indians throughout Mexico and North America. This apartment building at Chaco Canyon, New Mexico was the largest in the Western Hemisphere for centuries. But the Anasazi were completely wiped out by an 80-year-long drought during the 13th century. The western U.S. has had multi-century mega droughts, which are all natural, but Sir David wants people to believe that much smaller and shorter droughts now are caused by humans. When Stonehenge was built, the Arctic was much warmer and may have been ice-free. Trees grew all the way to the edge of the Arctic Ocean, where temperatures were 2.5 to 7 degrees Celsius warmer than they are now. The polar bear population survived this very warm ice-free period, showing that they don't actually need year-round Arctic sea ice. When the Vikings settled Greenland nearly 1,000 years ago, it was a much more hospitable place. The Vikings had wood available for fuel during the medieval warm period. But then the climate turned cold during the Little Ice Age and the Vikings froze to death. And more recently, during the 1930s, millions of climate refugees fled the Midwest and moved to California to escape the unprecedented heat and drought. Now let's take a look at the core issue of Sir David's misunderstanding about climate. He's making exactly the same mistake which Al Gore did. Antarctic ice cores show a strong correlation between temperature and the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Sir David interprets that as meaning that carbon dioxide drove the temperature. But his interpretation makes no sense scientifically. Not even the most ridiculous climate alarmist believes that this small change in the amount of carbon dioxide could have led to these huge swings in temperature. These ice cores show about 10 C swing in temperature with about 100 parts per million change in CO2. That's much higher than even the most extreme estimates of climate sensitivity. Another huge problem with Sir David's theory is that ice ages begin right when CO2 is at its peak, and they end when CO2 is at its minimum. That wouldn't happen if CO2 was driving the temperature. Reality is that Sir David is putting the cart before the horse. Changes in temperature are what controls the changes in carbon dioxide, not the other way around. When the oceans heat up, they outgas carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and when the oceans cool down, they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Everyone who's ever opened up a warm beer is familiar with this. It spews huge amounts of CO2 foam outside of the bottle, because warm water can't hold as much carbon dioxide in solution. This is one of the basics of geology which every geology student learns in their first semester. Sir David thinks that because the cart is close behind the horse, the cart must be pushing the horse forwards. His beliefs aren't very intelligent or educated, which isn't surprising because he's been hanging around with a lot of Hollywood types. The reality is that the reason that civilization grew over the last 10,000 years is because it was a very warm period. People do well in warm weather, and they do very poorly when it's cold. Over the past few decades, there's been a huge migration of people from cold regions like the northern United States and Canada down to warmer areas like the Gulf Coast. This migration isn't being driven by global warming. Rather, it's being driven by the fact that we now have fossil fuel powered air conditioning, which allows people to live comfortably in warmer climates. Lots of people used to die in heat waves. During the summer of 1911, 40,000 people died in Paris, and as many as 2,000 died in New England from the heat. This doesn't happen anymore for a couple of reasons. One is that we aren't having heat waves as bad as we used to, but the main reason is because we have fossil fuel-powered air conditioning. Sir David is demonizing and wants to take away the primary resource which has made Earth much safer for humans. So the question becomes, is Sir David a useful idiot, or does he have another agenda? Whatever it is, his dramatic speech about fossil fuels to COP26 had nothing to do with reality. This was a pretty good piece of filmmaking, but I preferred some which was made near Glasgow almost 50 years ago. It showed the best way to deal with annoying English blowhards like Sir David. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on these scamsters for the past 14 years. You can visit him, Kyrie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.
Go ahead.
Right, so hello there. I'm Holly Brown and I'm 9 years old.